My name is Ellen Tise, and I am the chair of the FAIFE Advisory Committee. This is our only session during the Congress this year, session 156. And the topic this afternoon is reaffirming Article 19 in troubled times. Now, you would probably immediately think, why did we choose this topic? So really, the session this afternoon will focus on the links of the conference themes of enable by advocating for intellectual freedom as a critical library value and working to identify and address challenges that libraries face in this area. And then also to the inspire theme by looking at new insights and innovative ideas around libraries' work to champion access to information and freedom of expression in today's evolving and challenging environments. So, the session will take a closer look at these developments and corresponding library responses aiming to meaningfully deliver on the rights codified in Article 19, for those who don't know which one we're referring to, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it refers specifically to the article that states everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and its interactions with other key fundamental rights. The effect of the pandemic on library and information access services and solution-based initiatives will be discussed, along with the impact of national and international political issues and crises on librarians, libraries, and access to information, censorship, manipulation of information, misinformation, and information pollution. So the committee who had organized this session, the FAIFE committee, hopes that this session will facilitate a discussion about high-level trends in freedom of expression and access to information affecting the work of libraries, drawing on recent experience of libraries in different parts of the world to look for some practical implications, considerations, and tips for libraries navigating these changes and trends. And this year, we're also delighted to involve two non-library speakers in the session this afternoon, because it's very important when we look at this to also bring in those views. So we have two speakers from the library field and two speakers from outside the library world. So I'm not going to introduce each one. I'll just mention all four speakers now, and as the one is finished, then the other one can come up. The first speaker will be Ertugrul Shimon. He is also a member of the FAIFE committee, and he is from the MEF University in Turkey, and he's going to speak about recent freedom of expression and freedom of information trends in Turkey. Then we will have David Banisar, and he is the speaker. He will speak. He is from Article 19 in the United Kingdom, and he's going to speak about a policy regulatory perspective on freedom of expression, digital rights, and the practices of online service providers. Following him will be Martin Wade, who I'm sure many of you do know, also former chair of this committee, and from CILIP in the United Kingdom. And he will speak about consolidating a new intellectual freedom policy for the UK, information sector, the consultation process, key takeaways, and the way forward. And lastly, we will have Gavin Sheridan from the Right to Know, and I don't know how to pronounce the second one, I'll just say from Ireland. I'm sure he will tell us more about that. And he is going to talk about key trends in Ireland's FOIA landscape. So we look forward to hear from the speakers, and thereafter we should have time for you to also ask questions and engage with them. So please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for joining us today. Actually, this is my destiny because I had another presentation on Tuesday afternoon. Also, it was the last session of the day. But there is a small improvement I got because I was the last presenter in that session. I'm improving myself. It seems I'm the first one in this session. Today I'm going to talk about the recent freedom of expression and freedom of access to information trends in Turkey. First of all, to understand the Turkish democracy, I'm going to bring you a short historical overview what happened in last 50 years, more than 50 years in Turkey. Then I'm going to tell you my story, why I'm engaging, why I'm involving this topic, and then we are going to turn back again Turkey. I'm going to talk about the ranking of Turkey on Freedom House reports. Then I'll try to finish my presentation. Let's start. I'm Ertuğrul Çimen. As Ellen mentioned, I'm the library director at MEF University, Istanbul, Turkey. Also, I'm the member of Freedom of Access to Information and Freedom of Expression Advisory Board, and I'm the member of Europe Regional Committee. Here is the democratical movement and interventions of Turkey. Actually, we got our first multi-party elections in Turkey in 1946. About 15 years later, on May 27 in 1960, the first COP took place in the Turkish Republic. President, Prime Minister, and others were arrested and tried for treason and other offenses. The Prime Minister and two ministers were executed. It was the first military coup in Turkey. Then about, again, 10 years later, economic downturn led to widespread unrest. The military intervened once again to restore order to other crimes on March 12 in 1971. Many people were arrested again and tried. And 1 year later, on May 6 in 1972, 3 young political activists were executed again. It was the revenge of the first blow was taken. About 10 years later, the second COP, clashes between left and right-wing groups led to another army COP. Hundreds of thousands of people were arrested again in the following years and executed dozens. Though one of them was 17, the military regime marked his age as 18 for his execution to be legal. Then again, another, not a real military coup, but it's an attempt, and the military offered a series of recommendations after the rise of welfare party. The government had no choice but to accept. Prime Minister was forced to resign. And lastly, about 6 years ago, we had another attempt, which was unsuccessful. But during that attempt, 251 Turkish civilians died, murdered. It was the short history of Turkish democracy. This is my story. You already had Turkish democracy story, and this is my story. I'm the son of 2 teachers. That means I got my first training about freedom of expression from my parents. They taught me to be truthful and honest and express my thoughts clearly. My father was fired just after the military coup in 1980. The reason was his previous political activities and expressions. He was one of the founders of the political associations of teachers, and he had never been a part of illegal activities. I felt the military pressure and expression limitations during my childhood and my education. I started my university education a few years after the military coup, and education, as in all other fields, was under military control. I'm an activist. I have always tried to express myself fearlessly because this is my inherited family responsibility. As a library professional, I'm responsible also for being impartial and supportive of defending all expressions. And of course, I'm responsible for being against misinformation and manipulated information. This was my story. Let's go back to Turkey. As I mentioned before, I always used Freedom House indicators to evaluate Turkish position, Turkey status. According to the 2021 indicators, Turkey's Freedom House score is 32. So that means Freedom House classifies Turkey as not a free country in 2022. The average ranking score of Turkey in the last 5 years was similar. It was around 32, 33. These figures show that Turkey is losing its position from partly free to not free. Because in 2027, Turkey was a partly free country, according to the 2016 indicators. But the Freedom House report shows that Turkey is not alone globally. For example, the United States of America, 11 points declined in the last decade. This decline is a severe problem for the country of freedom. Besides the governments, the social media companies use their own policies and bylaws to limit freedom of expression. All the experiences indicate to us as librarians that we need to be more active in freedom of expression and look at the problem with a global collaboration and cooperation approach. Here are the most popular topics for Turkey now. As you may know, Turkey withdrew from the Istanbul Convention by President's decision in 2021. But still, the issue is disputed. There are ongoing controversies in societies, especially women's associations were against that decision and moved it to the court. That decision will likely continue for the next couple of months or years. The other issue is press freedom. Turkey ranked press freedom at 157 worldwide, and several journalists are trailing in their journalism activities. Human rights, another topic many people prosecute, and some have problems due to protracted litigation and detention. There is a lot of information pollution, disinformation, and manipulation, especially on social media in Turkey. The government is drafting a law for social media posts, but human rights defenders claim it's a censorship law. The draft bylaw will be discussed in the next term in Parliament. Finally, there are currently over 5 million, officially 5 million refugees from different countries in Turkey. This is the highest number worldwide. Besides their other needs, these people need to get access to information, and they need to be informed by safe information. At this point, I believe that the libraries have a critical role in providing updated and safe information services for these displaced communities. Although, as librarians, we should offer specialized new information services for these people, I believe that we need more international collaboration and cooperation to provide that kind of services. Here is my last slide. Actually, I believe that the biggest obstacle to freedom of expression is the nationalist movements, because authoritarian governments use these arguments to manipulate societies as they wish and aim only to express their own thoughts. Of course, Turkey is a part of the world, and it is normal for it to be affected by global developments and movements. All of these reasons listed on this slide apply to Turkey as well. And freedom of expression and access to information is a global challenge that must be tackled. The gains achieved at the national or regional level do not make much sense when global movements are taken into account. I believe that the global cooperation and collaboration is necessary to achieve a lasting result. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for still being here on the last panel of the day of the conference. I'm Dave Benassar with Article 19. As you can guess by the name, no, we're not part of the UN, but we are an NGO that was founded on the basis of the Universal Declaration and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Call for a right to, every person has a right to seek and receive and impart information. Yes, I know that was in the wrong order. Shame on me. I should know Article 19 precisely by word. I'm going to talk a little bit about trends around digital and free expression, and a little bit broader than that, because I think we're in quite an interesting era right now. I've been around a while on this, and there's been sort of three eras of the internet and regulation, which covers, and when I say regulation, I'm meaning free speech, but also competition, privacy and data protection, consumer protection, the whole package of information rights. I mean, the first stage was in the early 90s. We were all young back then. We thought, wow, this is an exciting new tool that will change and save the world. And so we had the, let's not regulate the internet. It was a kind of very libertarian view, especially because this was being driven from the United States, especially from the West Coast of the United States. So it was, this tiny little new growing thing, let it grow, let's not regulate it at all. And we had some early litigation. There was the first law in the U.S., which was called the Communications Decency Act. And that was a lovely little law written by a Republican senator who was outraged by what he saw on the internet. So he made it so that anybody who provided any kind of internet service at the time, and there wasn't, frankly, that many people providing internet service at the time, and they weren't very big, but that they would be fully liable for anything that was done over their services. And this was vigorously opposed by civil society, and then industry didn't like it either, but they got a nice little carve-out, which said that they weren't liable if they moderated themselves, and that they weren't responsible if they moderated it good or bad or whatever. As long as they moderated it themselves, they weren't responsible for anything that anybody did. We didn't necessarily agree with that approach. We thought better to not have censorship at all than to give it just to corporations to moderate. So we said, forget it, we'll see you in court, and took it to the Supreme Court and won, which was an amazing decision, where the Supreme Court justice at the time wrote about how not burning down the global barn to kill the global pig or something like that. It was very colloquial. But the section that the industry had gotten in there as a deal to not oppose the law anymore, Section 230, remained in law. So we had a situation then where there was no internet censorship per se in the US, and an industry had a carve out so they weren't responsible for anything, whether it was privacy violations or anything else that was being done on their services either. And that was a situation started in 95, 96, I guess you could say, and has continued to today in the US. There was a second sort of phase, you could call it, starting in about the early 2000s, where you had the EU adopt something called the e-commerce regulation, which kind of adopted Section 230 with some limits on it, you could say. But this was an era where it was felt, oh, well, the internet is growing, they're making some money, this is a driver for the economy, let's leave them alone, but we'll put some small guardrails around them. At the same time, you had things a little bit earlier, but you had things like the Data Protection Directive, which did say there were limitations on how you could collect information, no matter what the medium was, and to do that. So that was sort of phase two. And then phase three sort of snuck up on us, which is over the last few years. We suddenly looked up and realized, oh my God, there's like 7 companies and they control the entire world and we can't do anything about it because they're too big to regulate now. So that's kind of the phase we are right now. But there's a change happening. And I can't really explain why there's this change. The 2016 presidential election in the US and the disinformation that went around with that, Brexit, the pandemic and all the misinformation and disinformation around that, any number of other things, the realization that things are too big and maybe there needs to be some restrictions. So we're now in an interesting phase where we're actually seeing a change from the e-commerce direction. Not so much what happened in the US with Section 230, they'll probably hold on to that until their dying days, but everything. And we're moving towards some sort of, not mass regulation of the internet and restrictions on speech, but a kind of movement towards something. I can't tell you what it's going to be. And the real example of that, and I'll dive into this in slight detail, is around what the EU is doing. So the EU has, I've lost count, I think it's 8 different digital packages that they're working on right now. Some that they've passed already, some that they're working on still. But these are really going to rewrite the rules in a lot of ways for not just the EU, but what's known as the Brussels effect. Sort of what happens in the EU does have a repercussion around the world because of its trade status and its status as influencing countries that it used to have colonial relationships with and everything else. So the EU and all these packages is really making a sort of change. And one example that's sort of an early of that is the GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, which has now become the global standard on data protection, on privacy. It's no longer the US, we don't need privacy at all standard. Industry knows what to do with our data and we're all going to be happy about it, so be quiet and don't complain. The GDPR has become that standard. There's 130 countries around the world now with data protection laws, which is an awful lot more than there was 10 years ago. It's about 50 or 60 more than 10 years ago. So there's been a huge movement towards data protection, and the GDPR is a big driver in recent times on that. But we have, and particularly related to speech, we see a couple of other really major things happening at the EU. One is the the Digital Markets Act, which has been passed, and that will regulate the gatekeeper companies, so the super large tech companies that we all know and love and don't pay their taxes and so on. They're going to be, subject to some kind of limitations on their competition, on how they're going to be open and so on. But for the purposes of here, what's more interesting is the Digital Services Act, which is not quite passed yet. It will probably be adopted in the fall. It's been through almost all the processes. It just has one more to go. And then it will go into effect for the most part in 2024. And that sets up a whole new set of rules for all online providers in the EU, which is about, the Commission estimates that's about 10,000 parties to this, so an awful lot. And then it sets up a whole lot of very specific rules. So for the 10,000, most of which are small and micro enterprises, a little bit of regulation. So things around having a point of contact for if you're engaged in Europe in some way or another. And you really do have to be actually engaged in Europe. It's not that you're a website in a random place, which occasionally Europeans deal with, but people who are selling to Europeans or so on, they'll be engaged. They'll be covered by this. But then for the VLOPs, which is the very large online providers, a great new acronym, they're going to have an awful lot of regulation. And that combined with the regulation they have under the Markets Act, I think it's going to be very interesting to see, and under soon to be the AI Act and the Data Act and the Data Governance Act. There's a ton of legislation out there at the EU level with all sorts of different boards being set up and oversight. It's going to be very interesting to see how these very large online companies are able to operate. So for instance, they're going to have to, for consumer protection, be a lot more stringent about who they, if they're an online provider marketplace, they're going to have to be a lot more stringent about who they're going to be offering that online marketplace to. They're going to have to know who the people are in a much better way than they do now. So all that dodgy stuff on Amazon may or may not still be there in a year or two. Don't worry, it will still be there. It's going to take a while to do that. And the issue of who's going to enforce it, there was a real problem with the GDPR that a certain country that I won't name, but let's just say it's kind of green and to the very west of Europe, just a hint, which didn't do a great job of enforcing data protection rules for all the companies that are all hosted here. The EU themselves are going to regulate directly some of the largest companies in the world, so they won't get away with that. How they're going to do it is another matter. Whether they're going to have the resources to do it, that's a different question. So I think this has got amazing implications for free expression. So the Digital Services Act is all about, law. It's all about legal but problematic speech. Lawful but awful is the nice way it's phrased. So disinformation, hate speech, well, hate speech is illegal, but things that are not necessarily illegal but are regulated by companies. And the online providers, which have been doing a frankly awful job of either being over-inclusive or under-inclusive in what they restrict, because they have ultimate powers to do whatever they want. If somebody pushes them in a particular country, they're more restrictive towards one political viewpoint, in another country, another political viewpoint. They've got to be an awful lot more transparent about it and a lot more accountable about it, which is going to be very interesting. Because for the first time, we've moved from, we originally had a model of restrict free speech only when a court orders it, to then 20 years of free speech is being restricted by companies and there's very little we can do about it because we've got a hands-off approach, to now the companies are still going to restrict it, probably using roughly the same things they're doing now, their own terms of services, but at the same time they've got to be accountable about it. And they got to be accountable in a couple different ways. So for instance, anybody whose account has been whacked, and I think all of us have seen one of our friends this happen to for some reason we can never explain, they've got to explain why, and there's got to be an appeals mechanism, and then there's got to be an external appeals mechanism too. So they're creating a real level of accountability, which, for instance, the Facebook Oversight Board tries to get to, but can never get to because it's not nearly big enough to be able to do all the cases that Facebook deals with. But that, I mean, that's going to be quite interesting. And another way they've got to be accountable is by being transparent. So they've got to explain both annually how many complaints they got, what they did with those complaints, and so on. So statistical information that's kind of there in the transparency reports, but if you look at them, you're like, what are you talking about? This is so bland, I can't get anything useful out of it. To now there's got to be much more granular data going to be available. Plus, regulators and academics are going to be able to get access in a detailed way, have legal rights to be able to get in there to the companies and see what they're actually doing. Right now, some companies allow it and then they whack it. Facebook has done that a few times with various people who have done an interesting job of discovering what Facebook is doing, and then they get rid of it. And then a third way is that there's going to be some mechanisms for when notices are given to get rid of certain accounts, shut them down or whatever. Some of that information is going to also flow directly to the commission. So the commission could create a database and hire some people or have academics do it to analyze what's being restricted and why it's being restricted. So there's going to be justifications needed to be applied to that. There's also going to be things around trusted flaggers, which is where there's trust NGOs mostly, but it could be industry also, and they're going to be able to, this is done in some cases already, but it's going to be much more broadly done, and quite interestingly, how that's going to work. Now, for the library community, couple things to flag. Some of you might be online providers, depending on what kind of services you're offering. You would obviously fall under the micro enterprises thing because of the amount of money, but there might be some application there for people in Europe who are offering some kinds of hosting services, some kinds of online discussion groups maybe. Some of that would be already covered under something else. So something to keep an eye out on when the thing passes and as the rules are floated. There'll be a lot of pressure, obviously, to exempt a lot of people in bulk, and there might be an opportunity there to do that. And then there's an interesting question around how you engage with the community in some of these things. So, you know, does the library community have a common thread with trusted flaggers? There might be. I think there's some interesting overlap around the issues of reliable information. And would that be an area where you could at least have discussions with those kinds of groups? And I think it's something to consider that would be useful. I wouldn't say you're necessarily going to agree on things, but there is at least an overlap around, you know, what is reliable information and how do you get those sources of information where there is some commonality. So that's all I'm going to ramble on for the moment. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Good afternoon, everybody, and can I say how much of a pleasure it is to be here today and see all of you, as Dave said, who are still hanging on in there. To change the scale, I wanted to talk this afternoon about, in my role as chair of CILIP's policy committee. SILIP, as you know, is the professional body for library and information workers in the UK, and it has decided to look at its policy on intellectual freedom. I put the URL up there because I'm not going to read it out in full. If you'd like to look at it whilst I'm speaking, if you want to go through that URL, you'll get to the Intellectual Freedom Hub, which has got both the draft policy and the draft guidelines on it for whilst I'm speaking. Quite interestingly, during the conference, I've spoken to quite a few people about intellectual freedom. It's something that affects us all. And when I've said what SILIP is doing, there's been a bit of a look ranging from, oh, that's interesting, to quite a few countries who said they're not going to touch it with a barge pole because of the polarization and some of the issues often within the profession. But that actually is probably a good reason why we should look at intellectual freedom, because it is what we're here for. So I'm going to leave this on for a few moments longer. So in the short time I have, I want to briskly walk you through an overview of how SILIP revises its policies, that's its policy framework, how intellectual freedom is being defined by SILIP, the consultation, why and how SILIP is consulting widely on the draft policy, say a little bit about the draft policy itself, and then move on to the next steps. So if all of you who've going to look at it have got it, I'll move on to say a little bit about, SILIP's policy framework. SILIP Policy Committee is a committee of external members who advise the main board on key policy issues. And on the screen you'll see our policy framework, and it derives from a number of essentials in the United Kingdom. First of all our policies derive from our ethical principles, which are also on the SILIP website if you want to look at them. 4 nations working. It's a really important issue for the UK. There are 4 nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. 3 of them have devolved governments, and all of those levels of devolution are different. And so there are different ways of developing policy, different governments developing policy for libraries right across the UK. So it's important that as a UK body, we do reflect all those different areas. Equality, diversity, inclusion is fundamental to what we do. And of course, it has to be based on relevant UK and international law. Or the way our government is going, its response to international law may get less and less. This is the model we're using for the policy on intellectual freedom. It starts with, as I suggested, Article 19 on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which the UK is still signed up to. We then look at our professional ethics, as I said, and then develop a new policy which includes practical guidance, as it has case studies from the real world. We found our members are very keen that we don't just produce a policy, but we help them understand it and be able to put it into practice. And practice is important, and we want to encourage ethical, reflective practice amongst all our members. So intellectual freedom, we take our definitions, of course, from the Human Rights Charter, and as the European Convention on Human Rights. So the initial definition we have is the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Unlike Dave, I don't feel the need to try and remember it offline, so I'll always keep it to hand. But it's also worth adding in the Article 10 of the European Convention that everybody has the right to freedom of expression, and that includes freedom of opinions and the right to share and receive information and ideas. It's the ethical foundation of why we are librarians. But we are aware that our members in the UK live in an increasingly polarised time when the logic of impartial free speech and informed debate has been inverted, it's been appropriated, and it's used now to justify hate speech and to restrict the expression of ideas rather than promote and encourage them. Only this week, police had to be called to a library in southern England to deal with aggressive protesters trying to disrupt a drag queen story time. They protested outside, and police had to be called to remove some of the protesters from inside the library during the story time. And so what we're aiming to do here is to help our members navigate these difficult waters, helping them make informed, ethical, and accountable choices on behalf of information users. Freedom of expression is not a freedom of accountability, and we stand for the right to challenge as much as the right to freedom of expression. As a reminder, that's the URL for our draft policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but as I say, I'm not going to quote the whole policy in full. This might sound a bit repetitive, but it's worth repeating that it's based on human rights and the ethics of our professional ethics. But it's also very important to remember that the right to freedom of expression and freedom of access to information, it's not an absolute right. They are legitimate rights, then legitimate rights can compete with each other. And there can be cases in legislation where absolute freedom of expression, as in hate speech, can be against the law. So what does our new policy say? Well, the policy states essentially that it's the role of librarians, information and knowledge professionals in all sectors, and there is a debate how this applies in different sectors, to promote intellectual freedom and oppose censorship and in the provision of services. The policy aims to be simple, clear, and it aims to be practical. And the second paragraph is essentially, it's the first part of the policy itself, which says that as library and information professionals, we are committed to upholding, promoting and defending human rights, equality and diversity, and intellectual freedom, including freedom from censorship. And the policy goes on to say that this is an active responsibility. It's not a passive responsibility, but as an information professional and knowledge professional, we have to be proactive in educating users about efforts to restrict their information rights, whether by the state, commercial interests, criminal organizations, or increasingly pressure groups and social media. Okay. Yep. In practice, we expect our members to oppose attempts to ban books and censor ideas along the lines that we're seeing in the US and increasingly the UK, and to safeguard the information of library users. The other part of the policy, as I say, is guidelines, and that in fact is going to be the larger policy. The aim is to have a simple, clear, principle-based policy, but then have a substantial document supporting individuals, supporting members in how they might actually put that into practice. So that can reflect context, it can reflect the sort of library, it can reflect the sort of audience. And these are the responsibilities our members will have when looking at putting the policy in practice. The policy is intended to be pragmatic and proportionate, clear and robust, and is intended to act as a line of defense and advocacy, support a member who is challenging censorship, but also be clear that we're not asking people to put their professional role, their job, or indeed themselves at risk. And if members' challenge or advocacy is unsuccessful, then it's CILIP's role to take up that issue and challenge and advocate on behalf of the member. And so we're consulting widely on that. We have launched a two-stage consultation. The first stage was with the professional community in the UK, with our special groups and some individuals. The second stage will be an open consultation, consulting with a wider library, information and knowledge professional. And just to conclude, some initial findings from our stage one consultation which will help us with the next stage. It's based on quite a good sample of 82 responses, mainly from group library professional groups with a good geographical and sector spread. 2/3 of people haven't been asked to censor materials, but that means a quarter have, which is a high proportion of the people who work in the UK, and half of those, nearly half of those who pushed back on requests to censor were successful. But I think the most important part of this is that over 80% of respondents were concerned, or very concerned, about challenges to intellectual freedom. The policy was well received for its simplicity and clarity, and there are a significant number of additional comments and suggestions. And looking ahead, we'd be actually interested in a wide range of views, including yours during the second stage of consultation, to make sure we get this policy right, not just for our members, but for every library and information user in the UK. Thanks very much.
Hello, everybody. I think it's this one, is it? Yeah, that's working. So I'm conscious of time. My name is Gavin Sheridan. I'm the co-founder of Right to Know, which is an NGO focused on access to information, and on VisLegal, which is a legal intelligence company. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just going to talk about access to information. So obviously, you can tell by my accent, I'm from around these parts. I've been doing FOI requests for too long, 15 years. And for those who don't know, I'll explain it very simply. A bit like the previous speaker who was mentioning the Article 19 and Article 10 rights of freedom of expression, the right to access information is almost like the poor sibling of the freedom of expression rights, but increasingly less so. So FOI is kind of one of the legal mechanisms citizens have to formally request information from a public authority in their own country or in other countries. Ireland has had this law since 1997, came into force in 1998, and believe it or not, Ireland rarely is an early adopter of these types of laws, but in this case we were. We were one of the first countries, one of the first 20 countries in the world to have a law like this one. We essentially copied and pasted it from the Australians and the New Zealanders back in the late 90s. We've had this law for quite a long time now, obviously. We had a really good first 5 years from 1998 to 2002, but then there was widespread institutional resistance inside public bodies to actually answering these requests, and also around the type of information that's being released could be potentially politically embarrassing to our political leaders, which is why in 2002, our government decided to introduce fees, upfront €15 requests for every request that a citizen might make. We remained at the time one of the only countries in the world to actually have a fee regime at all. I think it was ourselves and Canada. Then in 2014, our NGO, myself and a couple of other people campaigned to remove the fees following the crash. There was resistance institutionally to removing the fees, but eventually we succeeded. The €15 fee no longer applies. And now we're in a situation in 2022 where the department leading this initiative or leading this legislation wants to review it despite saying that it's working well. So we're a little bit suspicious about why you'd want to review something that they say is working well. And then in parallel with the freedom of information rights that people have, and again, these are rights that similarly fall under Article 10 rights under the Convention of European Rights, is the Aarhus Convention, which is a parallel regime around access to information on the environment. So it's based on international law, was brought into European directives in 2003, Ireland transposed in 2007. And this is like a separate request you can send that is not an FOI request, but is an AA request. So if there's a river in your town that is getting polluted, you have a legal right to ask for environmental information from a public body, such as your Environmental Protection Agency, and to get a copy of information relating to, say, that pollution. And we also ratified the convention formally in 2012. Key trends, and again, I'm rushing through this because I know we're time limited. If you're filing a request as a citizen and you're looking for information from public bodies, sometimes it's potluck whether that public body will actually know what it's doing. And this comes down to the public official not necessarily being well trained on what their obligations are under the FOI Act to you as a requester. This is a rights-based system. Also, you end up with these needlessly adversarial systems where I'm a faceless person who just sends an email to a public official who doesn't know who I am, and we get into a fight about whether they want to release the information I'm looking for or not, because potentially it's embarrassing information or it's sensitive information, but they also have to do what are called public interest tests about whether it's releasable or not, and also perform balancing tests about competing rights, as was mentioned earlier. You also have what I would call recalcitrant public bodies who are repeat offenders who systematically do not do their jobs when it comes to answering requests or refuse everything and just hope the requester goes away. These are common features in lots of jurisdictions when it comes to access to information law. And they often take a privileged basis for processing your request rather than seeing it as part of their normal job. They see it as an extra task over and above their normal job, which in fact it is not. Second thing, and trends in relation to the environment, and obviously you've seen the temperature changes in Europe over the past 2 weeks. Environmental rights are increasingly fundamental rights, and the Irish courts, in one of our court cases against Ireland, found access to environmental information to be a fundamental right under European law. It is not an administrative right, it is fundamental. So when you look at the trends in Ireland when it comes to accessing environmental information, our litigation generally tends to be around, well, is what you're looking for environmental or not? And is the body that you're asking for the information from actually a public body or not? We just won a case against RTE today that RTE denied they were a public body after 2 years of litigation, and we're probably going to end up in the High Court on that as well. We're also seeing very poor decision-making from the Information Commissioner up until about 2 years ago. The Information Commissioner was delivering very bad decisions. We took 13 court cases against the Information Commissioner to force them to make better decisions. Now they make really good decisions. And they're doing it on the basis of European law. And then there's also excessive delays in actually answering your requests or in appeals mechanisms, which also has implications for access to justice generally, which is another pillar of the Convention. I'll quickly mention key decisions because I know I've limited time. If you were to take things from this talk that I would recommend reading, it would be first, the case of Magyar Helsinki in the European Court of Human Rights. It was several years ago. It's the most fundamental decision from the European Court on why access to information is a part of your freedom of expression rights. It's a really important human rights case that really gives you as a European what your rights to access information fundamentally are. Fish Legal is another big European Court decision. I'd highly recommend reading the Open Data Directive, a recently passed law on citizen rights to access data from public bodies as opposed to information, although they're the same. Then the original Aarhus request. And then the one document I would ask everybody to read, if you're interested in what's going on with the environment when it comes to climate change, is the Aarhus Convention itself. It's a very simple document. It's 25 years old, and it is a radical document about what rights citizens have and NGOs have in the context of climate and in context of the environment. And lastly, right to know. We file hundreds of requests. We're funded by public donations, 13 High Court cases against the Information Commissioner, a successful complaint against Ireland, who was found to be in breach of the Aarhus Convention itself in Geneva 2 years ago. Ireland is now trying to bring itself back into compliance around timeliness of access to justice. And we're also involved in 2 Court of Justice cases, one of which I think might be interesting to librarians, which is around access to harmonised technical standards. At the moment, if you want to access a harmonised technical standard, you have to pay. Even though harmonised technical standards, which is the CE mark that you see on products in the European Union, actually you have to pay for those, even though they're part of EU law. And we've taken a case to Europe against the Commission, arguing that all citizens in the European Union should be able to access all harmonised technical standards without fee, because they're part of EU law. We are expecting a hearing later this year and a judgment next year in the Court of Justice. A lot of people are surprised to hear that actually there are laws out there that you can't actually read, which is a big issue. And I'll leave it there.
To all 4 speakers. So it looks like we would have time for one, if it's a short question, maybe 2. before we have to conclude the session. So could I just see if there's anybody who would like to comment or ask a question? I see there's somebody over there.
Hi. I was wondering if any of you could speak to the right to access to specifically health information, because you're talking about the right to information, but we did a presentation earlier today and discussed the right specifically to health information when you combine it with Articles 25 and 27.
It's a GDPR question.
Article 25 is the right to maintain good health, and Article 27 is the right to benefit from scientific advancement.
If I could ask a slight clarification, do you mean a right to health information about how the
Access.
community or about an individual accessing their own health information?
Okay, so actually, I meant the right to public health information.
All right.
Okay.
Go on then. That's an FOI question. You can answer that one.
Yeah, so I guess in the Irish or European context, obviously there's the GDPR for accessing your own health information, which is, again, a fundamental right under the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Your own health data is routinely accessed in Ireland through that mechanism. It is also accessed in Ireland through FOI legislation. But more generally, FOI or access to information laws as they apply, I've FOI'd the Irish health authorities for large amounts of information about how they spend money, for example. To me, these are usually enshrined in national legislation, and can be hard to get, I guess is the best way to put it. There is usually institutional resistance in health authorities to releasing health information in general, because it may reveal patterns that are not good for the health authority. They don't make the health authority look good. So it can be difficult. It can be like pulling teeth. But it can be done using access to information laws. And I think David would say.
And then let me add on to that. We did a report probably about 10 years ago called A Healthy Right, I want to call it. If you look on Article 19's website, you might be able to find it. And then more recently, in the context of COVID, we were looking into the issue around that. And there's an interesting thing that's kind of happening in Geneva, if interesting things can happen so much in Geneva, and that's that they're working on a convention now on pandemics. Whether it ends up as a binding convention or not is up to negotiations. But we've been arguing, because there's a gap in international law around health information. There's the general right to information. And then if you look at, for instance, the environmental conventions, there's obligations in most of the environmental conventions, Stockholm and Basel and all those, to make information public about chemicals that are being released into the environment or mercury that's being released into the environment. But there isn't an obligation for states to directly release health information. So we've been arguing that this convention, whatever it is that's adopted in Geneva, should include a specific obligation for states to make health information available, and that would be all around health policy, around health impacts, around spending, and so on, so that the states have a real clear obligation on that. But if you look at our COVID health information report that we put out last year, 2 years ago now, we've got a lot of detail on that you might find useful.
Thank you very much. As I said, we probably will only have time for the one question, and I'd like, therefore, to conclude this session. I think, as a profession, and as one of the major pillars of the Federation around freedom of expression and free access to information, I do believe that it's still one of the most important principles on which we can ensure the existence and the sustainability of libraries for the future. And I would like to thank the speakers by actually highlighting, and especially also from our speakers from outside the field, some of the areas and recommendations, because we had probably not foreseen And although we've been used as librarians with things like exemptions for libraries, how we're able to apply certain laws that can help us to ensure that we provide access to our citizens, to inform them better, to make better decisions, and as such also hold their governments accountable. And that's the fundamental role that I believe libraries should play. And, but the developments over the last decade, especially over the last 3 to 4 years, of course prior to that in terms of the advances in information technology, have changed completely the way that things that we have taken for granted or things that it may still apply. And I think that we've been made aware that libraries may also have to revisit and review and have to know a lot of these laws and legislation and identify the areas that we may have to adjust and adapt how we do things, but without compromising on Article 19 in terms of access to information and freedom of expression. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your contribution at our Congress, and we look forward, hopefully we will be able to continue to engage with you also in the future, and we won't be too far from Ireland next year, very close to the UK, as well as to Ireland, so who knows, we might invite you again to come and join us next year in Rotterdam. So thank you very much.
Thank you.